"Sir, step away from the gate. You don't belong here." The words didn't echo. They sliced, clean and confident, across the quiet of a $12 million estate just outside Atlanta. The wrought iron gates stood 12 feet tall, black steel polished to a mirror finish, guarding a driveway that curved half a mile toward a glass-and-stone mansion that caught the early Georgia sun like it was designed to hold light itself. And standing just outside those gates, hands in the pockets of a simple charcoal overcoat, was Darnell Williams. No entourage, no driver, no flashing headlights. Just a 6'2" black man in dark jeans and boots that had walked through boardrooms most of the country would never see. The head of security, a white man in his late 40s with a pressed uniform and a badge clipped just a little too proudly to his chest, stepped forward and repeated himself. "This is private property." His tone wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried the weight of assumption. Darnell didn't flinch. He had seen that look before. At 21, when a realtor asked if he was lost in a gated neighborhood he was touring to buy. At 30, when a valet questioned whether the Bentley was actually his. Now, at 46, billionaire founder and CEO of Williams Global Infrastructure, standing outside the front gate of the home his name was printed on in county records, he saw it again. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to Darnell Williams. The keypad beside the gate blinked patiently, waiting for a 6-digit owner override code. Darnell didn't touch it. Not yet. "Run the address," he said calmly. "Run my name." The guard gave a thin smile. "We already did. No delivery scheduled. No appointments." Two younger security officers shifted behind him, radios clipped at their shoulders. Watching like this was a routine interruption in an otherwise smooth morning. A neighbor walking her golden retriever slowed down on the sidewalk across the street. She recognized the house. She just didn't recognize the man being told he didn't belong. "I live here," Darnell said, not louder, just clearer. The head of security shook his head slightly, like he'd heard that line before. "Sir, the homeowner is Darnell Williams." A beat. "That's me." The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was diagnostic. The kind of silence that tests people. The guard glanced him up and down again, scanning sneakers instead of stock portfolios, posture instead of power. "We're going to need ID," he said, folding his arms. Darnell nodded once slow. He could have unlocked the gate from his phone. He could have overridden the entire system in 10 seconds. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket, not for a wallet, but for something else. His phone. Not to record. Not to threaten. To document. Because this wasn't about getting inside. It was about seeing who would try to keep him out. The Georgia air felt charged now, thick with something older than this morning. The security badge on the man's chest caught the sunlight. So did the small engraved plaque mounted discreetly beside the gate, property of D. Williams. The guard hadn't looked at it. He had looked at Darnell, and decided. The head of security extended his hand without warmth, palm open but posture rigid. "Identification," he said again, slower this time, as if repetition might create authority. Darnell studied the man's face, not with anger, not with challenge, but with recognition. He had built companies by reading rooms exactly like this one. This was not about security. This was about perception. "You ran the address," Darnell replied evenly. "Did you run the ownership file?" The guard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We ran what we needed to run." Behind him, one of the younger officers shifted his weight and glanced toward the guard booth, where multiple security monitors displayed live feeds of the property. Cameras at the driveway. Cameras at the pool deck. Cameras at the front entry. Every angle covered. Every inch protected. Except the truth standing 10 feet from the gate. The Georgia morning was warming now, sunlight climbing higher, reflecting off the glass facade of the mansion. Darnell could see the outline of his home office window from where he stood. That office had signed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It had hosted governors, investors, and executives. Yet here he was, being assessed like a stranger who had wandered too close. Across the street, the neighbor had stopped completely. Her dog sat beside her, ears perked, as she pretended to scroll on her phone while listening. A black SUV slowed as it drove past, the driver glancing toward the scene. The guard noticed the attention and squared his shoulders. Sir, I am going to ask you one more time to step back from the gate. The word step carried more weight than the request. Darnell did not move. Instead, he pulled out his wallet calmly and removed his driver's license. He did not toss it. He did not wave it. He simply held it out. The guard took it between two fingers, the way someone might handle something questionable, and examined it longer than necessary. Darnell Williams, he read aloud. Then he looked up again. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not recognition. Calculation. This does not prove you live here. The younger officer frowned slightly. Sir, the plaque says D. Williams, he offered quietly, nodding toward the small brushed steel plate mounted beside the gate keypad. The head of security shot him a look that silenced him instantly. We have protocols, he said firmly. We cannot just open gates because someone claims ownership. Darnell nodded once. Good, he said. You should not. That answer caught the guard off balance for half a second. He had expected frustration, maybe raised voices, maybe indignation. Instead, he received agreement. Then follow the protocol fully, Darnell continued. Check the owner registry. Check the contract holder for your firm. Check the emergency override contact. The guard hesitated. It was subtle, but it was there. Because those records were not theoretical. They were real. And if he accessed them, he would see a name that matched the license in his hand. We will verify through dispatch, he said instead, turning slightly toward the booth. He handed the identification back without apology. Darnell accepted it without comment and slipped it back into his wallet. His phone remained in his other hand, screen dark, waiting. Inside the booth, the younger officer began typing into the security system terminal. The click of keys sounded louder than it should have in the quiet neighborhood. 30 seconds passed. Then 45. The officer's brow furrowed. He looked up at his supervisor. There is an owner profile under Darnell Williams, he said carefully. The air shifted. The head of security did not turn around immediately. Full name? He asked. Darnell Anthony Williams, the younger officer replied. The supervisor inhaled slowly through his nose. There are a lot of people with that name. Darnell almost smiled. Almost. Not with this tax parcel number, he said calmly, reciting the exact county record from memory. The neighbor across the street lowered her phone slightly. The SUV that had slowed earlier had now parked halfway down the block. The morning had turned into an audience. The supervisor stepped into the booth himself now, brushing past the younger officer, and leaned toward the monitor. He scanned the screen longer than he needed to. His expression tightened. There it was. Owner clearance level. Primary contact. Direct authority over contracted security vendor. The system did not lie, but pride sometimes does. He stepped back out of the booth and faced Darnell again, his tone shifting only slightly. We still need to confirm through corporate. Darnell tilted his head just enough to signal understanding. Of course, he said. Call them. He glanced at his watch. 9:23 in the morning. He had a board call at 10. He had budget approvals waiting. He had an entire infrastructure firm moving across 3 states. And yet, this moment mattered more. Because the test was not whether the gate would open. It was whether character would. The head of security pulled a company-issued phone from his belt and stepped a few feet away, speaking in a low voice that was meant to project control. This is Gate Alpha at the Williams property, he said into the receiver. He did not say Mr. Williams. He did not say homeowner. He chose his words carefully, as if the wrong noun might weaken his position. Darnell stood where he was, coat still buttoned, hands relaxed, gaze steady. He was not looking at the man anymore. He was looking at the gate. 12 feet of reinforced steel. Motion sensors. Remote locking system. Contracted protection that his office paid nearly $30,000 a month to maintain. Protection that was now protecting him from himself. The younger officer inside the booth kept glancing between the supervisor and the screen, uncertainty growing across his face. The morning had lost its ease. 2 more vehicles had slowed while passing, drivers curious about the unusual standoff at one of the most recognizable estates in the county. The supervisor's tone shifted slightly as the person on the other end of the call spoke. Yes, he said, eyes narrowing. Yes, that name. A pause. He is claiming to be the owner. Another pause, longer this time. Darnell could not hear the voice on the other end, but he could read the posture. The shoulders stiffened. The chin lifted defensively. Pride resisting data. After a moment, the supervisor lowered the phone but did not hang up. He stepped back toward Darnell, expression guarded. Corporate says the primary owner contact is not scheduled to arrive today, he said. The statement was delivered like a verdict. Darnell tilted his head slightly. I do not schedule arrivals at my own home, he replied calmly. The younger officer inside the booth spoke up again, quieter this time, but firmer. Sir, the file lists his personal number as the primary override. The supervisor shot him a look, but the seed had been planted. The truth was in the system. It had been from the start. What they were resisting was not information. It was adjustment. We will need to confirm by contacting the owner directly, the supervisor said, almost challenging him. Darnell nodded once. You have my number, he said evenly. He raised his phone and held it up, screen facing outward. It is the one listed. The air shifted again. A flicker of doubt crossed the supervisor's face. He looked down at the phone still in his hand, then back at Darnell, then toward the booth. Pride and protocol were colliding in real time. Across the street, the neighbor had abandoned the pretense of scrolling. She was openly watching now, her expression tightening as realization began to form. Darnell could feel the moment stretching, tension threading through the quiet, suburban morning. This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was a decision. The supervisor turned back toward the booth and dialed the number listed on the owner profile. Darnell's phone began to ring instantly in his hand. The sound cut through the air like a bell in a courtroom. The younger officer looked up sharply. The neighbor's eyebrows lifted. The supervisor froze for half a second, staring at the device in Darnell's palm as if it had betrayed him personally. Darnell did not answer immediately. He let it ring twice. 3 times. Then he swiped to accept the call and held the phone to his ear without breaking eye contact. Darnell Williams speaking, he said calmly. The supervisor's face lost its color. The younger officer stepped fully out of the booth now, eyes wide, looking from one man to the other as the reality settled in. The ringtone had not just confirmed identity. It had confirmed authority. The supervisor ended the call slowly, lowering the phone as if it weighed more than before. For a moment, no one spoke. The morning birds continued their indifferent chorus. The security cameras hummed quietly overhead. Darnell slid his phone back into his coat pocket. You had the information, he said, not accusing, not loud, just factual. You chose not to see it. The supervisor cleared his throat. Sir, we were following procedure. It was a smaller sentence now, less certain. Darnell stepped one pace closer to the gate, not aggressively, simply closing distance. Procedure does not require assumption, he said. Procedure requires verification. The younger officer swallowed and glanced at the supervisor again, waiting for instruction. The entire scene had shifted. What had begun as a confident dismissal had become a public lesson in real time. And Darnell had not raised his voice once. The gate remained closed, but something else had opened. The truth had arrived. Now it was up to them what to do with it. The silence that followed the ringing phone did not feel like relief. It felt like exposure. The head of security stood facing Darnell Williams with the gate still locked between them, the steel bars now less a barrier and more a mirror reflecting every decision made in the last 15 minutes. The younger officer shifted again, this time not in uncertainty, but in realization. He had seen the name in the system. He had said it out loud. He had felt the shift before anyone else did. Across the street, the neighbor finally spoke, her voice carrying just enough to be heard. Is everything all right? She asked, not to Darnell, but toward the uniformed men who had been so certain moments ago. The supervisor cleared his throat and adjusted his stance. Yes, ma'am, he said quickly. Just verifying access. The words sounded different now. Smaller. Darnell watched him carefully. He did not gloat. He did not smirk. He simply observed. This was the moment that separated mistake from character. The supervisor reached toward the keypad as if to open the gate immediately, eager to correct the visible imbalance. Darnell lifted one hand slightly. Not yet, he said calmly. The motion stopped. The younger officer looked from Darnell to his supervisor, confusion flickering again. Sir, the supervisor asked. You were right about one thing. Darnell continued evenly. Procedure matters. He stepped a half-pace closer to the gate, sunlight catching the edge of his coat. So let us follow it completely. The supervisor hesitated. The system confirms ownership, he said carefully. We can open the gate now. Darnell's gaze did not waver. Before that, he replied, I would like the full incident log from this morning. Every entry, every timestamp. and I want confirmation that body cameras were active. The younger officer stiffened slightly at the mention of body cameras. The supervisor's jaw tightened again. Sir, that is not standard, he began. Darnell interrupted gently, not raising his voice. It is standard when the property owner is treated as an intruder. The words settled over the driveway like a formal ruling. The neighbor across the street lowered her phone completely now. She was no longer pretending to mind her own business. She was witnessing something shift. The younger officer stepped forward cautiously. Sir, he said to Darnell, the log shows initial denial at 9:18. Identification check at 9:20. Verification attempt at 9:23. Owner confirmation at 9:25. He swallowed. Body cameras were active. The supervisor shot him another look, but it lacked its earlier sharpness. The power dynamic had changed, not because the gate had opened, but because truth had been acknowledged publicly. Darnell nodded once. Good, he said. Please email the footage and logs to the address listed under owner contact. The supervisor shifted his weight. Sir, that may need approval from corporate. Darnell met his eyes steadily. I am corporate. The sentence was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was simply precise. The younger officer's shoulders dropped slightly, as if tension he had been carrying all morning finally found direction. The supervisor inhaled slowly and nodded once. Understood. Inside the booth, he began typing rapidly, forwarding files, his earlier certainty replaced by mechanical compliance. Darnell glanced briefly toward the mansion in the distance. The house stood exactly as it had before. Nothing about the architecture had changed. What had changed was the clarity of the moment. He remembered another gate, years ago, outside a luxury development he had been considering investing in. A security guard had told him sales were by appointment only and suggested he return during business hours, though it was 2 in the afternoon. He had returned the next week with paperwork proving his net worth exceeded the entire project valuation. That memory did not make him bitter. It made him precise. The supervisor stepped out of the booth again, posture now more formal than defensive. The files have been sent, he said. The younger officer nodded in confirmation. Darnell studied both men carefully. One more question, he said calmly. If I had raised my voice this morning, would your response have been different? Neither man answered immediately. The question hung heavier than accusation. The supervisor finally shook his head slowly. No, sir. It was an honest answer. Darnell gave a small nod. Good, he replied. Because volume is not authority. He glanced once more at the gate keypad. Now, he said quietly, open it. The supervisor entered the code, and the 12-foot steel gates parted smoothly, the motor humming as if nothing unusual had happened. But everyone standing there knew something had. The driveway was open. The test, however, was not over. The gates moved slowly, deliberately, as if even steel understood the weight of the moment. The motor hummed and the panels parted wide enough for a vehicle to pass, revealing the long stone driveway curving toward the mansion. Darnell did not step forward immediately. He remained where he was for a few seconds, looking past the open entrance, and then back at the 3 men who had stood between him and his own property less than 5 minutes earlier. The supervisor straightened instinctively, as if expecting the scene to conclude now that the path was clear. The younger officer kept his hands clasped in front of him, eyes lowered but attentive. The third guard remained near the booth, quiet, uncertain which direction authority now flowed. Darnell finally took a slow step forward, crossing the threshold of the gate without ceremony. Gravel shifted softly beneath his boots. He walked just inside the property line and then turned back to face them again. The open gates framed him from behind, sunlight catching the glass walls of the house in the distance. Close it, he said calmly. The supervisor hesitated, confused. Sir. Darnell held his gaze. Close the gate. The order was not emotional. It was structural. The supervisor entered the command, and the steel panels slid shut again, sealing the entrance the same way they had stood. When this began, only now the dynamic was different. Darnell stood inside. They stood outside his authority, waiting. You said you were following procedure, Darnell began, his voice steady, measured, almost instructional. So let us examine it. He stepped closer to the gate, close enough that they no longer had to raise their voices to hear him. When you first saw me, what did you assess? The supervisor opened his mouth, then paused. We assessed a person attempting entry without prior notice, he answered carefully. Darnell nodded slightly. Based on what? The supervisor shifted his weight. There was no scheduled arrival logged. That was not my question, Darnell replied evenly. What did you assess before you checked the system? Silence settled again. The younger officer's eyes flicked toward his supervisor. The supervisor's jaw tightened. He knew the truth. It was in the hesitation. We assessed potential unauthorized access, he said finally. Darnell let the words hang for a moment. Because, he prompted gently. No one answered. Across the street, the neighbor had not moved. The SUV down the block remained parked. The morning had turned into a lesson no one expected to attend. Darnell inhaled slowly. When I was 23 years old, he said, voice still calm, I tried to enter a residential community where I had just signed a purchase agreement. The security guard told me I must have the wrong address. I showed him the paperwork. He told me to wait outside while he confirmed with someone inside. He paused. I steady. I waited 40 minutes in my own driveway. The younger officer swallowed. The supervisor looked down briefly. Today, Darnell continued, I waited 9 minutes and 32 seconds before the system confirmed what I told you in the first 30 seconds. He glanced toward the booth. You had the information at 9:23. You did not accept it until 9:25. The precision in his tone was not accidental. It was documented. Sir, we were trying to be thorough, the supervisor said, voice quieter now. Darnell nodded once. Thoroughness does not require doubt in the face of confirmation. He let that settle. It requires neutrality. The younger officer stepped forward slightly. Sir, I saw the owner clearance. I said it, he admitted. Darnell looked at him, expression softening just a fraction. You did, he acknowledged. Then he turned his gaze back to the supervisor. Leadership is not about being right. It is about correcting quickly when you are not. The supervisor's shoulders seemed heavier now, the confidence from earlier replaced with reflection. I understand, he said. The words carried weight this time. Darnell studied him for another long moment. Do you? He asked quietly. The question was not aggressive. It was diagnostic. The supervisor held his gaze. Yes, sir, he answered. Darnell looked toward the house once more, then back at the men at the gate. This property is protected by your company, he said. But protection without discernment becomes exclusion. He stepped back slightly, creating space between himself and the steel bars. And exclusion based on assumption is not security. It is liability. The younger officer lowered his head slightly in agreement. The supervisor exhaled slowly. The air felt different now. Less tense. More exposed. Darnell reached into his coat pocket once more, pulling out his phone. He did not dial immediately. He simply held it, looking at the screen as if weighing the next move carefully. The open gate had not ended the moment. It had only revealed its true purpose, and the decision that followed would define more than just a morning shift. Darnell looked at the screen of his phone for a long moment before he tapped a single contact. He did not step away from the gate. He did not lower his voice. The call connected on the second ring. Angela, he said calmly, I need you to activate vendor review protocol for the Williams residential contract. There was no panic in his tone, no anger, just clarity. The supervisor stiffened slightly at the phrase vendor review protocol. He knew enough about corporate language to understand what that meant. It was not a complaint. It was an audit. On the other end of the line, Angela's voice was crisp and alert. Understood. Is this related to the security team at Gate Alpha? She asked. Darnell glanced at the men in front of him. Yes, he replied. Full review. Incident logged at 9:18 this morning. Body camera footage active. Owner misidentification despite system confirmation. He paused. I want executive oversight. The younger officer's eyes widened slightly. The supervisor held his posture, but the confidence that had once framed it was gone. Angela responded without hesitation. Review process initiated. Contract performance history is being pulled now. Do you want suspension pending evaluation? Darnell did not answer immediately. He let the question breathe in the morning air. Suspension was immediate. Termination was final. Evaluation was procedural. The neighbor across the street shifted her stance, still watching, sensing that something larger than a gate access dispute was unfolding. Place the current on-duty team on administrative hold effective immediately, Darnell said evenly. Reassign temporary coverage from the secondary vendor until review is complete. The supervisor's composure cracked slightly. Sir, he began, that is not necessary. Darnell held up one hand gently, not silencing him with force, but with authority. "It is already done," he said quietly into the phone. Angela confirmed the instruction. Administrative hold initiated. Access credentials will be deactivated within 60 seconds. The younger officer instinctively reached toward his badge as if he could feel the coming change. The supervisor's jaw tightened again, this time not with pride, but with consequence. Darnell ended the call and slid the phone back into his coat pocket. No theatrics. No raised voice. Just decision. The supervisor's radio crackled softly. A notification tone sounded from the booth terminal. The younger officer looked down at the access panel mounted near the gate controls. His clearance indicator shifted from green to amber, then to red. The supervisor checked his own badge. The digital display mirrored the same status change. Access suspended. Not fired. Not humiliated. Suspended pending review. Procedure followed completely. The third guard near the booth stepped back uncertainly, looking from one man to another, unsure whether he still had authority to stand where he was. "Effective immediately," Darnell said calmly. "You are relieved of active duty on this property, pending review of conduct and adherence to non-discrimination protocols outlined in Section 4 of your contract." The precision of his language left no room for interpretation. The supervisor exhaled slowly, absorbing the reality of what had just happened. "Sir, we were trying to protect your home," he said, voice steadier now, but edged with something else. Darnell nodded once. "Protection without judgment is effective," he replied. "Protection with bias is exposure." The younger officer lowered his head slightly, understanding the distinction. Across the street, the neighbor finally stepped forward a few feet, no longer pretending neutrality. She looked at Darnell with a mixture of apology and admiration. He acknowledged her with a brief nod before turning back to the men at the gate. "You said you were following procedure," he reminded them gently. "Now we are." A black sedan turned onto the street at that moment, marked discreetly with the secondary vendor's insignia. It slowed as it approached the gate, driver clearly briefed by dispatch. The timing was precise, efficient, quiet. The supervisor watched the vehicle approach, realization settling fully now. This was not an emotional reaction. It was structural correction. Darnell stepped back from the gate once more, creating distance. "You will receive formal communication within the hour," he said evenly. "Review will determine final employment status." The words were not cruel. They were clean. The morning air felt lighter, though not softer. The open test had reached its conclusion. The gates had not only separated property from street, they had separated assumption from accountability. And Darnell Williams had not raised his voice once. The secondary security vehicle rolled to a controlled stop outside the gate, engine idling softly, the driver stepping out with measured awareness as he took in the scene. He had already been briefed. Temporary reassignment. Administrative hold. Owner present. The morning had shifted from routine to reckoning in less than 20 minutes. The suspended supervisor stood still, badge now useless against the scanner, radio quiet at his shoulder. The younger officer kept his hands clasped in front of him, posture no longer defensive but reflective. Darnell Williams watched the replacement team approach without satisfaction on his face. There was no triumph in his expression, only standard. The new lead officer nodded respectfully. "Mr. Williams," he said clearly. "Not sir. Not homeowner. Not subject. Name." Recognition changes tone faster than authority ever will. Darnell returned the nod. "You have temporary control of this post," he said evenly. "Ensure full compliance with Contract Section 4 and immediate debrief from outgoing personnel." The new officer confirmed without hesitation and moved to assume the position. The contrast was quiet but undeniable. The original supervisor finally spoke, voice lower now, stripped of the rigid certainty from earlier. "Mr. Williams," he said carefully, the name landing differently this time. "I misjudged the situation." Darnell met his eyes steadily. "You misjudged the person," he corrected calmly. The words did not sting. They clarified. The neighbor across the street had stepped closer to the curb, no longer pretending this was a routine security check. She watched as the replacement officers took positions, efficiency replacing resistance. The suspended supervisor continued. "It was not intentional." Darnell inhaled slowly, not dismissing the statement, but not accepting it without context either. "Intent does not erase impact," he replied. Procedure does not excuse assumption. The younger officer nodded almost imperceptibly. He had seen the moment pride overrode information. He had felt the shift before it was acknowledged. Darnell stepped slightly closer to the gate once more, sunlight catching the lines in his face. When you looked at me this morning, he said calmly, you did not see the file. You did not see the clearance level. You did not see the contract holder. He paused. You saw a possibility of threat before you saw a possibility of ownership. The supervisor's shoulders dropped slightly. There was no argument left, only recognition. The replacement officer signaled that the gate systems were secure and operational under new command. The driveway beyond remained quiet, the mansion standing unchanged, its glass reflecting the sky as if none of this had occurred. But something had changed. You blocked me at my own gate, Darnell said evenly, the sentence landing like a measured verdict. And you did it confidently. The supervisor lowered his gaze for a brief second before meeting Darnell's eyes again. I understand, he said. This time it sounded less defensive, more honest. Darnell studied him for another moment. Good, he replied. Because understanding is the only thing that prevents repetition. The administrative hold was not spectacle. It was structure. The suspension was not revenge. It was review. The younger officer finally spoke, voice steady but respectful. Mr. Williams, I should have pushed harder when the system confirmed. Darnell looked at him, expression thoughtful. You spoke, he said. That matters. The younger officer absorbed that quietly. Leadership recognizes small courage before it grows. The replacement team completed their transition swiftly, logging into the system, verifying cameras, confirming perimeter integrity. The process was seamless because it was built to be. The flaw had not been in the structure. It had been in interpretation. Darnell took one step back as the gate controls reset under new authority. The morning sun climbed higher, washing the steel bars in brighter light. This review will be thorough, he said calmly. If your actions reflect a pattern, the outcome will reflect that. The supervisor nodded once, accepting what he could not undo. The neighbor finally called across the street. I am glad you are home. It was a simple sentence. Darnell gave her a small nod in acknowledgement. Home is not just property. It is belonging without question. The new lead officer stepped aside respectfully. The gate is secure, Mr. Williams. Darnell walked toward the keypad one final time. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. He entered his personal override code, and the 12-foot steel gates opened smoothly once more, this time without resistance, without doubt, without commentary. He paused at the threshold and looked back briefly at the men who had stood between him and his own driveway less than half an hour earlier. Authority, he said calmly, is not volume. It is responsibility. Then he stepped forward, crossing fully onto the stone driveway as the gates closed behind him with quiet precision, not as a barrier, but as acknowledgement. Darnell walked the length of the stone driveway without looking back again, the mansion rising ahead of him in glass and limestone, quiet and immovable against the Georgia sky. The gates closed behind him with a soft mechanical certainty, sealing the morning's lesson outside the property line. Inside, the air felt different. Still, controlled, earned. He did not rush toward the front entrance. He walked with the same measured pace he had held at the gate, because urgency would suggest emotion, and this was not emotional. It was structural. As he reached the front steps, his phone vibrated once in his coat pocket. Angela. He answered before the second ring. Status, he said calmly. Preliminary contract history review complete, Angela replied. There have been 3 prior complaints filed within the last 12 months regarding differential treatment at this property entrance. 2 were dismissed internally as miscommunication. 1 was labeled unresolved. Darnell stopped walking. The word unresolved carried weight. Were any of those complaints escalated to executive review? He asked. No, Angela said. They were closed at the regional operations level. Darnell looked back toward the distant outline of the gate, now barely visible from where he stood. 3 prior complaints. Patterns do not shout. They repeat. Initiate full termination clause under Section 9, he said evenly. There was no hesitation in his voice. Effective immediately? Angela asked. Effective immediately, Darnell confirmed. Vendor contract for this property is void pending formal review. Secondary vendor remains in place. A pause on the other end. Understood, Angela replied. Notices will be sent to corporate and Regional management within 5 minutes. Darnell ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. The morning sun reflected off the wide glass panels of the mansion, turning the surface into a mirror. He saw his own silhouette faintly in the reflection. Calm, unmoved, precise. Down at the gate, the suspended supervisor's phone began to vibrate almost simultaneously with the notification from corporate headquarters. The younger officer checked his device a second later. Access suspended had just shifted to employment terminated pending review. Contract dissolved. Administrative hold replaced by permanent separation. The replacement team at the gate maintained their positions professionally, saying nothing, because structure speaks loud enough when it functions correctly. The supervisor read the message once. Then again, his shoulders settled in a different way now. Not defensive, not proud, simply aware. The younger officer exhaled slowly as he read his own notification. The third guard near the booth stared at the screen, as if hoping the words might rearrange themselves. They did not. Across the street, the neighbor watched the new security team operate seamlessly, unaware that behind the scenes, a company contract had just dissolved because of 9 minutes and 32 seconds of assumption. Darnell reached the front door and entered his access code, stepping into the cool interior of his home. The foyer was quiet, high ceilings stretching upward, natural light pouring through tall windows. Nothing inside had changed. But outside, a system had been corrected. His phone vibrated once more. Angela again. Termination notices confirmed, she said. Regional director requesting call. Darnell walked toward his home office, footsteps steady against the polished floor. Schedule it for this afternoon, he replied. Include compliance and training leads. Yes, sir, Angela responded. Darnell paused before the office door, hand resting lightly on the handle. He thought briefly of the earlier memory at 23 years old, waiting outside a property he already owned on paper. He had not raised his voice then either. He had simply taken notes. Built differently, structured differently. This morning was not about punishment. It was about alignment. He opened the office door and stepped inside. From the large window behind his desk, he could see the top edge of the gate at the end of the driveway. Steel against sky. Control without chaos. He sat down slowly and looked at the clock. 9:48 in the morning. 30 minutes from insult to termination. Not because he was angry, not because he was offended, but because authority that cannot distinguish ownership from intrusion is not authority. It is risk, and risk, when documented, is eliminated. The gates stood firm at the end of the driveway, operated now by a team that understood the difference between vigilance and bias. The house remained still. The morning continued, but the standard had been raised permanently. By 10:15 that morning, the house was quiet again. Sunlight streamed through the tall glass panels behind Darnell Williams's desk, stretching across polished wood floors that had never once questioned who belonged inside them. The incident log from the gate sat open on his tablet, each time stamped clean and clinical. 9:18. Initial denial. 9:23. System confirmation. 9:25. Owner verified. 9:48. Contract terminated. The numbers told the story without emotion. Precision is powerful when it is documented. His phone vibrated softly on the desk. Regional Director Mark Ellison was calling in. Darnell accepted the call without greeting. I assume you have reviewed the footage, he said calmly. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a careful response. Yes, Mr. Williams. We are reviewing it now. The tone carried restraint. Corporate language always does when liability is present. 3 prior complaints were closed without escalation. Darnell continued evenly. Explain that. Another pause. It appears they were categorized as customer perception issues rather than procedural violations, Mark answered. Darnell leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes fixed on the distant outline of the gate visible beyond the driveway. Customer perception becomes procedural violation when it repeats, he said quietly. Bias that is dismissed becomes pattern. Pattern becomes culture. Culture becomes exposure. The silence that followed carried understanding. Mark cleared his throat. We accept responsibility for the oversight. Darnell nodded once, though the gesture could not be seen over the phone. Responsibility is not apology, he replied. Responsibility is correction. He stood and walked slowly toward the window, hands relaxed at his sides. The gate looked smaller from this distance. Less imposing. More mechanical. Effective immediately, he continued. All contracted security under your management will undergo mandatory non-discrimination training audited by third-party compliance. No internal reviews. External oversight. Understood, Mark responded. Additionally, Darnell said, voice steady. All complaint reports will bypass regional filtering and escalate directly to executive compliance when filed on properties under my ownership. The instruction was not emotional. It was architectural. Systems fail when gatekeepers filter discomfort. We will implement that change today, Mark said. Darnell ended the call without ceremony and remained at the window for a long moment. Outside, the new security team operated quietly and efficiently. No raised voices. No assumptions. Just protocol executed without interpretation. Across the street, the neighbor had returned home, her dog no longer alert. The morning had resumed its rhythm. But the standard had shifted. Darnell thought briefly of the young man at the gate who had spoken up when the file confirmed his name. Small courage matters. Systems change when someone decides to speak before comfort settles in. He walked back to his desk and opened a blank document. The heading was simple. Property Access Standard Revision. He typed deliberately, outlining new expectations. Verification before conclusion. Confirmation before denial. Respect before assumption. Not as slogans. As policy. Each line clear. Each sentence accountable. 30 minutes earlier he had been told he did not belong. Now he was redefining what belonging required. He paused and looked again at the incident log. 9 minutes and 32 seconds between assumption and truth. That was all it took to expose a fracture in a structure designed for protection. He closed the file and folded his hands on the desk. I did not raise my voice, he said quietly to the empty room. I raised the standard. The words were not meant for applause. They were meant for permanence. Authority is not proven by dominance. It is proven by discipline. Outside, the 12-foot steel gates stood exactly as they had before sunrise. But they no longer guarded a culture that tolerated assumption. They guarded a property governed by clarity. And clarity, once enforced, does not retreat.